Imagine waking up to discover your entire army, hundreds of thousands of Manis, already dead and doesn't know it yet. Imagine watching a city crushed, another on the edge of annihilation, while commanders gamble with fate itself. This is the week where every decision on the Eastern Front became a matter of pure survival. And you're about to witness it unfold, moment by moment. It is September 17th. And the commander of the Southwestern Front finally gets the green light from Stalin to pull back. But the truth, it's already far too late. His armies are boxed in, surrounded from every direction by German forces closing in like a steel vice, as Kyiv collapses into enemy hands. Far to the north, General Zhukov steels himself for a last-man-standing defense of Leningrad. In the center, Field Marshal Bok sharpens his blade for an offensive he believes will end the entire war in one decisive strike. Last week ended with the Kyiv pocket snapping shut, the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic gone. And with it, almost the entire Southwestern Front trapped inside. Guderian and Kleist, after weeks of brutal fighting, finally joined up southeast of the city. Stalin's generals had begged for permission to withdraw earlier, but he refused. And now, hundreds of thousands are cornered. This week, from September 17th to the 23rd, we find out exactly what the Soviet leader plans to do next. Meanwhile, up north, the fighting for Leningrad is reaching a breaking point. Zhukov had only just arrived during week 2, but in typical Zhukov fashion, he immediately tore apart and rebuilt the entire defensive structure of the city. Before he showed up, Leningrad's defenses were collapsing, morale in free fall. Under his command, that wasn't going to happen. Any officer who drifted toward defeatism, despair, or refused to counterattack the excuse was instantly removed. No debate. You'd be shocked how often this part of command is forgotten. The ability to stay composed after weeks of non-stop losses. For the Red Army, already crushed by some of the worst defeats in modern history, that strength was absolutely vital. Harsh proclamations swept through the ranks to stop morale from disintegrating. Not a step back. Do not surrender a single verst of land approaching Lenin. And on the 17th, combat order No. 6-4 hit like a thunderbolt. Any commander, political worker, or soldier who left their assigned position without written permission would be shot on sight. By the end of last week, a German offensive smashed into the 42nd and 8th Armies, cutting off the 8th's planned counterattack. Before it even started, Leib intended to encircle the 55th Army, outflank the 42nd, and punch straight into Leningrad, isolating the 8th Army in the process. Volodarsky and Uritsk both fell, forming the Uranenbaum pocket, slicing a massive portion of the 8th Army away from the city. Yet somehow, the defenders held long enough for the 55th to withdraw in order. Slipping out of the trap the Germans hoped to slam shut. Pulkovo would hold until the 19th, and even then the Soviets managed to cling to the heights after a brutal tank fight against the 1st Panzer Division. Germany was stopped just 12 kilometers from the city center. That savage battle on the Pulkovo Heights, combined with the redeployment of panzer and motorized troops to Army Group Center, plus sheer exhaustion ripping through German units, began to quiet the fighting for the rest of the month. Army Group North Zone reports admitted 60,000 losses, many of them irreplaceable NCOs and junior officers. The Red Army counted 316,639 casualties across the 3 fronts fighting in the north. Since July 10th, on the 24th, Leib finally told OKH the truth. Army Group North couldn't continue the offensive. They had no choice but to dig in. As the Wehrmacht stalled, Hitler issued Directive No. 1A 1641 on September 22nd, declaring openly his intention to wipe Leningrad off the map. Not just the military, not just the port, everything. His plan, a tight blockade and relentless artillery fire of every caliber, combined with non-stop aerial bombardment, to erase the city from the earth. Even though this week's battles flattened the inner blockade line, they still hadn't cut the Lake Ladoga supply route. Fighting raged on. The 8th Army launched an attack toward Krasno Selo on the 19th, with 4 rifle divisions. but the Germans counterattacked the very next day. The 8th was shoved back to the Novi Petrograd-Petrovskaya line before managing to stabilize. To the west of Leningrad, the Neva operational group grabbed a bridgehead at Dubrovka but couldn't push further. Still better than Kulik's 54th Army, whose offensive toward Sinyavino collapsed almost immediately. These two actions would later be known as the First Sinyavino Offensive. They performed terribly on the ground, but strategically, they forced German command to divert units from Europe and from Army Group Center. Even the 8th Panzer Division and parts of the 96th Infantry Division were pulled north, weakening the German push elsewhere. And all this was happening while Holder continued plotting a strike at Moscow. In August, he convinced Hitler that the capital needed to be taken before winter. But they couldn't start because he needed all mobile units untouched, and the other army groups kept demanding forces. Instead, Guderian was sent south, helping form the Kyiv encirclement, while another motorized corps was diverted north to Toropets. Both flanking army groups got bogged down for all of August and most of September. Even Yelno-Once, the perfect launch point toward Moscow, had to be abandoned under heavy Soviet assault. Hitler and Holder argued endlessly about how to win the war to bits. That should have been settled long before Barbarossa even began. Holder insisted that capturing Moscow would end everything, despite a strategic study in late August admitting the war would continue into 1942. And planning should assume that reality. By the end of August, Hitler told Halder to target the Soviet armies west of Moscow and destroy them one by one. Holder twisted this plan aimed at Army Group Timoshenko, near Vyazma, turning a two-pronged encirclement into a three-pronged drive straight toward Moscow itself. And using vague wording in Hitler's directive, he siphoned off nearly every mobile unit from army groups north and south. At the end of August, Hitler instructed Holder to conduct operations against Soviet forces west of Moscow, aiming to defeat them sequentially. Holder then redirected the plan, targeting Army Group Timoshenko near Vyazma, altering it from a two-pronged local encirclement into a thread-direction offensive oriented toward Moscow itself. Using ambiguity in Hitler's orders, Holder reassigned as many mobile units as possible from army groups north and south. In total, 4 infantry divisions, 9 panzer divisions, and 4 motorized divisions were shifted toward Army Group Center during September. Bach was placed in command of 14 panzer divisions, and the Tonda motorized divisions, the largest concentration of German mobile formations. Up to that point, these forces were backed by 47 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, and 5 security divisions. Around 1.9 million personnel, organized into roughly 78 major formations, prepared for what was expected to be a final decisive operation. The offensive received the name Operation Typhoon on the 19th of September, as planning intensified. The start date was set for the 2nd of October, although Guderian's units would begin 2 days earlier due to greater marching distances. At the beginning of September, however, roughly 30% of tanks in the 3 designated panzer groups were non-op, with another 23% undergoing repairs in German factories. On average, only about 34% of tanks were immediately The transfer of nearly 300 tanks from Germany increased readiness by roughly 10%. One estimate suggests the 2 newly formed panzer divisions fielded around 450 tanks, while the remaining 12 divisions combined held approximately 750. Army Group Center also lacked about 22% of the vehicles required, and engineers anticipated rapid truck losses once the offensive began due to mechanical strain. Although additional vehicles existed in Germany, Hitler wished to reserve them for forming new panzer divisions. Supply shortages became so severe that Guderian's requisition teams reportedly clashed with elements of the 8th Army Corps over trucks found in the Kyiv encirclement. By the 26th of September, German forces had suffered approximately 534,952 casualties. Around 15% of the initial Barbarossa force. Only about 385,000 replacements had arrived, leaving a deficit of roughly 150,000 personnel. Logistical pressures on Army Group Center worsened through September. Rail deliveries rarely approached the required 30 trains per day, and flooding halted supply rail movement for 8 days. At the front, continuous skirmishes and artillery exchanges consumed significant ammunition and fuel. Commanders prioritized stockpiling fuel and ammunition, forcing troops to rely heavily on local resources. Supply bottlenecks caused missed deliveries, including non-essential items being shipped instead of critical engine components. Winter clothing was scheduled to arrive in early November, based on expectations that only a small occupation force would still be needed by that point. Planners believed the campaign would be largely resolved, and logistics would ease further once a third of the army was demobilized to release manpower for industrial work. Paradoxically, the preparations for Operation Typhoon represented both of the Wehrmacht's greatest concentration of force and clear evidence of its deteriorating strength since the launch of Operation Guderian's panzer group had only recently completed the encirclement near Kyiv, when orders arrived, instructing it to move north as soon as possible. Although his depot at Romny was well stocked, his transport trucks were already heavily worn and nearing collapse. The panzer units had been stationary for nearly a week, yet fuel and even basic rations were already running short. At one point, they had to rely on Luftwaffe airdrops to sustain operations. The 47th Panzer Corps recorded on the 18th of September that recent heavy use on extremely poor roads had severely degraded their trucks. With spare parts not arriving, even minor mechanical problems could not be repaired, leading to unusually high numbers of vehicles being declared unserviceable. The troops needed rest and refitting, but it was increasingly clear they would not receive either. Instead, they prepared for renewed Soviet breakout attempts as the Luftwaffe and German infantry worked together to reduce the Kyiv pocket. After this, the panzer units were expected to move north in preparation for Operation Typhoon. The 5th Air Corps focused on striking the southwestern front as extensively as possible. One officer claimed the Luftwaffe would accomplish half the work of the army. During the third week of September, the 5th Air Corps dropped hundreds of thousands of pounds of munitions on Soviet positions and conducted more sorties than at any previous point in the campaign. 2 Air Corps also flew intense operations over the Kyiv pocket. Together, they destroyed thousands of Soviet vehicles. At Tistash, the Luftwaffe held firm air superiority in the region. Soviet VVS aircraft seldom flew in this sector, and when they did, most were intercepted or dispersed. Attacks that reached the German armored units were generally ineffective. However, losses mounted for the Luftwaffe as well. Every aircraft lost was increasingly difficult to replace. Having begun the invasion with about 2,995 operational aircraft of all types, the Luftwaffe had fewer than 1,000 serviceable airframes by the time the Kyiv encirclement was closed. In September, the commander of the 2nd Air Fleet reported to headquarters that the Luftwaffe was overstretched and nearing its limits. The 6th Army under Field Marshal Rykino was ordered to assault Kyiv directly. Although encircled, the city remained heavily defended and contained the highest concentration of Red Army forces within the pocket. On the 16th of September, Karpones had received verbal permission from Timoshenko and Commissar Khrushchev to withdraw toward the Sel River, but he refused to act without written confirmation. This written authorization arrived on the evening of the 17th, though it instructed only that Kyiv itself be abandoned. Nevertheless, Karpones had already begun preparing for withdrawal. The 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Armies were directed to break eastward through the thin German armored line roughly 200 kilometers from Kyiv, while the 38th and 40th Armies were ordered to strike toward Romny and Lubny to secure the flanks. It was too late. Moving in the open, Soviet columns became fragmented under constant air and ground attacks, forming 3 major pockets and numerous smaller dispersing groups. The fighting devolved into disorganized engagements as Soviet troops attempted to escape under difficult conditions. Many breakout efforts were improvised and launched with whatever forces were available, causing significant losses on both sides. Elements of the 26th Army held out the longest, until the 26th of September, before being avoided. Karpones himself was killed on the 20th of September when his headquarters and parts of the 5th Army were overtaken by the 3rd Panzer Division near Kryukivshchina Farm. The southwestern front had consisted of roughly 850,000 personnel, including reserves and support elements. On the 1st of September, of the 700,544 casualties the front had suffered since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, 616,304 occurred during the Battle of Kyiv. Only about 15,000 individuals were estimated to have escaped the insurrection. 4 Soviet armies comprising 43 divisions were effectively eliminated. This outcome occurred despite the objections of several of Hitler's military advisors. The success at Kyiv further strengthened Hitler's confidence in his own strategic judgment, a view shared by a small but influential group of generals within the OKH. Timoshenko had assumed command of the southwestern front on the 11th of September after Budeny was removed for advocating withdrawal from Kyiv. His early optimism evaporated quickly. His initial headquarters at Poltava had been overrun, and he now faced the task of rebuilding nearly an entire front, while simultaneously establishing a defensive line to protect what remained of Ukraine. German forces captured Kyiv on the 19th of September. As infantry units moved deeper into the city, they made a disturbing discovery. The NKVD had installed radio-controlled explosive charges in numerous buildings. On the 20th of September, the first detonation occurred. The devices had been placed in locations where German troops were expected to take up quarters. The situation in the city became more unstable due to widespread looting by some civilians and some German personnel. Kyiv had no functioning power grid, limited running water, and very little food available. On the 24th of September, additional explosions began occurring regularly. NKVD operatives attempted to spread fires triggered by the blasts, and the central districts of the city quickly came under threat as the fires expanded beyond control. The lack of running water in Kyiv severely hindered any ability to respond to the fires and explosions. The detonations resulted in the deaths of roughly 200 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians. Although these losses were comparatively limited, the impact on morale was significant. Many of those affected were staff officers, which disrupted coordination and contributed to rising confusion throughout the city. German occupation authorities misattributed responsibility for the incident to the local Jewish population, despite the fact that many of them were among the victims of the destruction. This false accusation was then used to justify the mass killing at Babin Yar later that month, which became the largest single massacre the German forces had carried out. Up to that point, even as fighting continued, German planners were already determining the next steps of the campaign. Guderian began redeploying his units wherever infantry divisions could take over their sectors. Kleist prepared to push his limited forces in a rapid advance across Ukraine, toward Donetsk and beyond. The lower Dnieper region remained unsecured, and the 1st Panzer Group was tasked with addressing this while also advancing towards Stalino. The 11th Army received orders to prepare for an assault on the Pelikop Isthmus. Meanwhile, the 6th and 17th Armies were to continue pushing east to protect the northern flank of the armored spearheads. Some German officers even believed they might reach the Don River before year's end. Rostov lay more than 500 kilometers further east, but the mood following the WWII success made such ambitious goals seem plausible. Amid these setbacks, the Red Army did achieve one notable success. The defenders of Odessa launched a coordinated ground, airborne, and amphibious operation at Highorovka on the 21st of September. This action expanded their defensive perimeter by 5 to 8 kilometers and pushed Romanian heavy artillery out of range of the harbor. In a week defined by severe setbacks, this small victory provided a welcome boost for Soviet forces.